Judge Grayson thought this would be just another case. A stolen car, a guilty plea, an easy conviction. But when Jalen Dawson stood up to defend himself, the entire courtroom shifted. Because the moment he started speaking, it became clear this trial wasn't going the way they expected. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The air inside Los Angeles County Courthouse felt thick, almost suffocating. The rows of spectators in the gallery murmured among themselves, shifting in their seats as they watched the scene unfold. At the defendant's table, Jalen Dawson stood with his hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. 19 years old. Charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, the stakes were high, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear. This trial wasn't really about the law. It was about who Jalen was. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his desk. He peered down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson's voice carried a dry amusement, the kind that made it obvious he had already made up his mind. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. Because while they saw a clueless teenager, Jalen had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one. He never planned on standing here as a defendant, but he knew courtrooms like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. Jalen had grown up listening to the stories she brought home. How prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. The judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick," he muttered. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again. But this time, something shifted. Because while they were still laughing, Jalen wasn't. Instead, he smirked. A faint, almost imperceptible thing. Because Grayson had just made his first mistake. And the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. Jalen said nothing, as Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat, smoothing the front of his crisp navy suit. He moved with the confidence of a man who had already won, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he approached the jury box. "Your Honor," Carrington began, voice carrying that rehearsed authority of someone who had given the same speech 100 times before. "The state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. In the gallery, spectators shifted. A few whispered. On the surface, it sounded airtight. A stolen car, a chase, running. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on." Carrington took another step, letting his gaze sweep across the jury. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He paused, then turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest." His voice dipped lower, carrying just the right amount of condescension. "What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. The question hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. Jalen still didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a neatly stacked pile of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me." And for most people in the room, It probably did. A stolen car, a police pursuit, fingerprints, case closed. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right," he said, turning toward the defense table. "Let's hear the response." Lisa Thornton, Jalen's public defender, hesitated before rising to her feet. She adjusted her blazer, clearing her throat. "Your Honor, my client." Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated. Then, quietly, she sat back down. Jalen straightened, slipping his hands from his pockets. Then, for the first time since the trial began, he spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went completely silent. Judge Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second, before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward. Because everything was about to change. Jalen let the silence stretch, just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Jalen took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate. Not rushed, not defensive, like a man who wasn't standing trial, but leading an argument he had already won. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored. "That's right." "And that testimony is written in his report?" "Of course it is." Jalen nodded. Then, turning to Judge Grayson, he said, "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Grayson squinted at him. "On what grounds?" Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time, gesturing toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Jalen continued, his voice even. "In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jalen took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But—" he let the word hang in the air. "I have a feeling it won't." Now the gallery wasn't just whispering. They were leaning forward, watching, listening. Grayson frowned, turning toward Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Jalen tilted his head. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it." He let the statement sit for a second longer, then added, "But if he wasn't?" Silence. A slow, heavy silence that made the jury shift, that made Grayson's fingers pause against the desk. The cracks in the case were forming. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor, does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed. Jalen took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, learning their tactics. And there was one thing he knew without a doubt. If Carrington was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, finally shaking his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. Carrington's fingers tightened around his pen. Just a little. Not enough for most people to notice, but Jalen did. Because that hesitation, that small crack in confidence, it meant everything. Jalen didn't rush. He let the weight of the moment settle, let the jury absorb what had just happened. They weren't looking at him the same way anymore. Before, he had been the defendant. Now he was the one leading the case. Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes. His voice was steady, but his grip on control was slipping. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. That's true, he took a step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, making deliberate eye contact with each one of them. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. He let the words sit, let them weigh on the room. Let's think about this logically. Jalen took a breath, his tone staying calm, controlled. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up. Then you put it back on the rack and walk out. His gaze swept across the jurors. They were following him now. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Jalen tilted his head slightly. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Carrington shifted in place. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question, he continued, was parked outside A7B11 hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. He shrugged. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside, just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flicked through his notes. Searching for something, anything to regain control. Jalen wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, he turned to Grayson. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then, reluctantly, no. Jalen's lips pressed together. So let me get this straight, he said smoothly. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen nodded, like that was all he needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Jalen wasn't done yet. Because the next thing he was about to say, it would change everything. Jalen took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. The room shifted. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. Carrington stiffened, and Jalen saw it. He saw the slight clench of the jaw, the way the prosecutor kept his hands perfectly still, as if any movement might betray him. Jalen didn't need confirmation. He already knew. They had buried it. And I think I know why, Jalen continued, his eyes locked onto Carrington. The prosecutor forced a neutral expression. Go on. Jalen pulled out a printed transcript from his file, holding it up for the jury to see. He read aloud, his voice crisp, precise. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Carrington's shoulders went rigid. Jalen held up the paper. That's from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. The shift was instant. The jury wasn't just listening now, they were questioning. Jalen turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle, but Jalen shook his head. Oh, his voice didn't rise. but it cut through the courtroom like a blade. I wasn't. Silence. A thick, heavy silence that made Carrington's face flush. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned," Jalen continued, his voice measured but sharp. "Walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car, I wasn't near the car, I wasn't running from anything." He let the words settle, let them sink in. The only thing tying me to this case. He took one last step toward the jury. Bad police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was deafening. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence now cracking around the edges. He had built his case on certainty, on the assumption that Jalen Dawson was just another easy conviction. But now, the cracks were too wide to ignore. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. He flipped through his notes, as if searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Finally, his shoulders dropped. A small defeat, but a defeat nonetheless. "No, Your Honor." The words landed like a hammer. Jalen remained still. He had been preparing for this moment from the second he stepped forward. But now that it was here, he let himself breathe. Judge Grayson exhaled, rubbing his temple. He glanced toward the jury, then back at Carrington, as if weighing his options. Then he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. "Case dismissed." For a second, no one moved. Then, chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling in their notebooks, cameras flashing, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Jalen didn't move right away, didn't react. He let the moment settle, let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Grayson still gripped his gavel, watching Jalen with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe even regret. Jalen met his gaze, held it. Then, finally, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, a free man. But just as he reached the door, Grayson spoke again. "Mr. Dawson." Jalen stopped, but didn't turn. The judge hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Jalen smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. Cameras flashed, catching every movement, every shift in Jalen's expression. "Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother, Denise Dawson, was waiting, arms crossed, expression unreadable. For a long moment she just looked at him. Then finally she shook her head and let out a slow breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one," he said. The cameras kept flashing, but Jalen wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he'd remember this one, because Jalen had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. Message of the story. How many other cases have gone this way? How many people have been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that values efficiency over truth? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back. But what about those who don't? The justice system isn't broken, it's working exactly as it was built. Cases like Jalen's happen every day, The difference? Most people don't get the chance to fight back. Privilege isn't about innocence, it's about access. Jalen wasn't freed because he was innocent, he was freed because he had the tools to prove it. Power only listens when it's forced to. Judge Grayson didn't respect Jalen at the start. He dismissed him, mocked him, but by the end he had no choice but to listen. The system needs more people like Jalen. People who won't just fight for themselves, but for the ones who never got the chance. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. Real-world reflection. Lessons we can't ignore. Jalen's story isn't unique. It's just one of the few that ended the right way. For every wrongful arrest that gets challenged, there are thousands that don't. Innocent people take plea deals because they don't have the resources to fight. Prosecutors push cases forward even when the evidence is weak. Judges treat defendants like they're guilty before the trial even starts. So what can we learn? Knowledge is power. Jalen won his freedom because he knew the system better than it knew him. Understanding your rights isn't just important, it's necessary. Question everything. If the evidence seems airtight, ask why. If the process feels rushed, ask who benefits. The system relies on people not paying attention. Privilege decides outcomes. Jalen had the tools to fight back, most don't. If you have access to resources, use them to uplift others. Change starts with exposure. If this story made you think, share it, talk about it, challenge assumptions, because silence is what allows injustice to keep winning. The system won't change itself. It has to be forced to.